quiet October evening in 1938, families across America gathered around their radios, as they did every night. What some of them heard would convince them that the world was ending. Aliens, they were told, had landed. Monstrous machines were marching across the countryside. The army had been destroyed, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. It was not real. It was a radio play. But for a great many listeners on that strange and famous night, it was terrifyingly, completely real. Welcome to Curio Hour, where we uncover the strange, the unsolved, and the unforgettable. Today's story: the War of the Worlds broadcast. To understand this story, you have to understand the world of 1938. There was no television in people's homes, no internet. The center of family life in the evenings was the radio. Every night, millions of people tuned in. They listened to music, to comedy, to drama. And crucially, they listened to the news. And these were tense, frightening times. In Europe, the shadow of war was growing. The threat of a coming conflict hung over everything. Just weeks earlier, radio had been full of urgent, breaking news bulletins from across the Atlantic, interrupting programs with the latest crisis. So the public had grown used to one particular thing: the idea that their evening's entertainment might, at any moment, be broken into by a sudden, alarming report. Into this world stepped a young, ferociously talented man named Orson Welles. Wells was just 23 years old, but he was already a star of the stage and of the radio with a magnificent, commanding voice. He led a talented theatrical company who produced a weekly radio drama. Each week they would adapt a famous story and perform it live on air. For their broadcast at the end of October, they chose a science fiction classic. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, the tale of an invasion of Earth by Martians. But Wells and his team wanted to do something clever and new. Rather than simply narrate the story, they decided to update it, to set it in the present day in America. And they would tell it not as a story, but as if it were really happening. Live, as a series of breaking news bulletins. On the evening of Sunday, the 30th of October, 1938, the night before Halloween, the broadcast began. It opened clearly with an announcement. The Mercury Theater on the air, presenting Orson Welles in The War of the Worlds. Welles himself spoke a brief introduction. Then the program seemed to settle into an ordinary evening of dance music from a hotel ballroom. And it was here that the genius and the danger of the broadcast revealed itself. Because the pleasant music was suddenly interrupted by a breaking news flash. Astronomers, the announcer reported, had observed strange explosions on the surface of the planet Mars. The music returned. Then another interruption. Something had crashed to Earth on a farm in a place called Grover's Mill in New Jersey. The bulletins now came faster and more urgently. A reporter was sent to the scene, broadcasting live, his voice tense with excitement. He described a huge metal cylinder, half buried in a farmer's field. A crowd had gathered, and then the top of the cylinder began to unscrew. Something was emerging. The reporter's voice rose in horror as he described a creature with glistening, leathery skin and tentacles climbing out. Then a flash of flame. A heat ray. The reporter described people being incinerated where they stood. And then his broadcast cut out into dead silence. The bulletins escalated with terrifying speed. The military was mobilizing. Martian war machines, towering tripods, were rising up and advancing. The army, listeners were told, had been crushed. Poison gas was spreading. The Martians were marching on New York City itself. Now, anyone who had heard the start of the program knew that this was a play. A clever, thrilling piece of drama. But here is the crucial thing. Not everyone had heard the start. That night, the most popular show on radio was on a rival station. And it was common for listeners to start there and only turn the dial during a dull moment. And so, a portion of the audience tuned in late. They missed the introduction entirely. And they landed without warning in the middle of what sounded exactly like real breaking news. They heard urgent reporters, official-sounding government voices, reports of death and destruction in a real American town they could find on a map. There was no reason in that moment for them to think it was anything but true. And the broadcast was masterful. The pacing, the sound effects, the convincing performances. It all felt utterly, frighteningly authentic. For these listeners, the unthinkable was happening live in their living rooms. The Earth was being invaded. And so, the story goes, America panicked. According to the newspapers the next day, frightened citizens flooded police stations and newspaper offices with desperate phone calls. People reportedly packed their families into cars and fled their homes. Some, it was said, wrapped wet towels around their faces to protect against the Martian poison gas. There were tales of people praying in the streets, of fainting, of citizens grabbing weapons to defend themselves against the invaders. In Grover's Mill itself, the very town named in the broadcast, it is said that armed locals on edge even fired at a water tower in the dark, mistaking it for a Martian machine. Meanwhile, in the studio, Welles and his company performed on, largely unaware of the alarm spreading outside. Partway through and at the end, the program reminded its audience clearly that this was only a Halloween story. A bit of fun, nothing more. But for those who had been gripped by terror, the damage, supposedly, was already done. The next morning, Orson Welles awoke to find himself the most talked-about man in America. The newspapers were ablaze with the story. Headlines screamed of mass panic, of terror sweeping the nation, all caused by a single radio play. Welles appeared before the press, looking apologetic, expressing his shock that anyone could have taken it seriously. There was outrage. There were calls for new rules to stop such a thing from ever happening again. But for Welles, the scandal was the making of him. He had become a household name overnight, and his career soared to extraordinary new heights. The broadcast became a legend. The night the radio convinced a nation that aliens had landed. But in recent years, historians have asked a fascinating question. Just how big was the panic, really? And the surprising answer is, perhaps, far smaller than the legend suggests. The radio audience that night was actually quite small, and many of the dramatic stories of panic appear to have been exaggerated or invented by newspapers. The newspapers, it turns out, had their own reasons. They saw radio as a dangerous young rival, stealing their readers and their advertising. And here was a perfect chance to make radio look reckless and irresponsible. So the truth seems to be that while some listeners were certainly frightened and some did call an alarm, the great nationwide panic was, in large part, a myth. A story about a fake invasion that became itself a kind of fake story. And yet the legend endures, because it speaks to something we recognize. The strange power of a voice in the dark to make us believe almost anything. On Halloween Eve in 1938, a young man, a microphone, and a clever idea gave the world a fright it has never quite forgotten. The night the Martians came to New Jersey.